Good evening. As we gather tonight to commemorate the centenary of my father, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, just a few weeks before his 100th birthday, there are numerous happenings around the world in honor of this date. Scholarly conferences in Chicago, Paris, and Moscow, unveiling of monuments, numerous theatrical and film productions of his works, and of course, the continuing publication of his books. But tonight, here in this 92nd Street Y, so famed for music and poetry, I am grateful and excited to have the chance to leave aside for a moment the novels, stories, and essays for which Solzhenitsyn is so rightly renowned, and to celebrate his extraordinary life and creative journey through fresh eyes by sharing with you some of the music and poetry in his life and work. Just as I was often asked as a youngster, do you want to be a writer too? So I'm asked these days, did your father play an instrument? He did not, but loved music from an early age and throughout his long life. My parents listened to music constantly, whether on radio or on their modest but inspired LP collection. In fact, one of the most vivid memories from my childhood is of coming into my father's study and stopping dead cold on the doorstep, struck by the unearthly power coming from his little table radio. I remember us both listening for a good while, and I asked him, what is this? And he just said, that's Beethoven. He would have also named the number of the symphony, but unfortunately I don't remember which one it was. We will return to Beethoven, of course, more than once tonight. But music played a major role, not only in his life, but also in his writings, where it frequently serves to sharpen context, to evoke memory, or uncover the true psychology of an unfolding scene. So tonight, we will hear some of the music that memorably sounds in his works, and some of the music inspired by them. We will also hear the music of his poetry, from the wartime rhythms of Prussian nights to the melancholy rolling train wheels of Fumus Patriae, to the lyrical undulations of Reflection in Water, a prose poem which has as much rhythm and lilt as many a piece of formal poetry. Above all, we will rediscover the courage and compassion at the heart of his message, as he asks of himself and of us whether in the midst of nihilist, collectivist bleakness, we dare to affirm the infrangible dignity of the individual and the certitude that one word of truth shall outweigh the whole world. But how did the future novelist, the boy who dreamt of nothing but writing long form, come to write poetry? To understand this, we have to know something about the dramatic arc of his early life and what brought him to that fateful night when, as he himself is about to describe for us, under the pitiless stars of a freezing labor camp night, he conceived his epic poem, The Trail, Doroženka in Russian, The Trail. Solzhenitsyn was born exactly 1 month after that great armistice that brought to an end the war to end all wars, a seminal day whose centennial the entire world marked just a few days ago. Yet he was born into a new war, as Russia had just suffered, of course, the great upheaval of revolution and was now plunged into the horrors of civil war. His parents were married just a short time when the Great War had broken out in 1914, and his father, a university student, enlisted. Ironically, he survived both war and revolution, but not a careless hunting accident, which meant that my father never knew his own father, who died a few months before he was born. So his mother, and you see both of them here, raised him alone in great poverty and in great fear of being discovered because to have been, or to be the widow of an officer of the imperial army was very near to a death sentence for her and for her child. The young Solzhenitsyn was a voracious reader, and already at age 9 read War and Peace, and resolved then and there to become a writer. His own great historical epic, The Red Wheel, was conceived and begun at 17 years of age, as it happens 82 years ago yesterday. And not finished, however, for 55 more years, as war, imprisonment, disease, his battle against the Soviet machine, and exile kept interfering in a quite literal sense with his chief project. In university, we see him here in university, he majored in math and physics, disciplines that were, of course, somewhat less subject to Marxist dogma than literature. He was 22 and just out of university when Hitler invaded the USSR, almost exactly the same age as his father when the previous war broke out. He too volunteered, was eventually accepted to officer school, and then sent to the front. He fought bravely, was twice decorated, would have been a third time for leading his unit out of encirclement in January 1945, but was suddenly arrested just weeks before the taking of Berlin. Military censorship had discovered his correspondence with a friend critical of Stalin's leadership of the country. So he was hauled back to Moscow, sentenced by secret tribunal to 8 years in the camps, followed by perpetual exile in Kazakhstan. And so begins the experience that more than any other would alter the course of his life. When he found himself in the camps, he faced death first and foremost physically, of course, from hunger and disease and overwork. We see him here in the first months of imprisonment. But not less importantly, death as a writer. He was not allowed, he nor any other normal, ordinary prisoner, was not allowed books, paper, or even a pencil. So it was at this verge of extinction that he most clearly realized that he must bear witness and tell the world. And the only way he could do it was through memorizing every word he would write, and therefore that he would need to write poetry. So this is how was born the concept of the Trail of Dorozhenka, this magnificent epic poem that describes his and Russia's first 30 years under the communist yoke. It's a work that is deeply meaningful to me, as more than any other, it traces the outline of my father's education and life. It shaped his outlook and worldview. Or rather, what shaped his outlook and worldview is reflected in this poem. Almost providentially, I suppose, I was inspired in what turned out to be his penultimate summer to ask him to sit down with me and to go over this entire text. And we did that for several hours a day for several weeks. Went over from beginning to end all 12,000 lines that, again, he had memorized, committed all of them to memory, and only wrote down, or rather typed out, when he found himself in exile. And we discussed his symbolism, his metaphors, as well as actually the very literal meaning of specific objects, circumstances, people we meet along the way. And at that time, I had already translated chapter 5 for publication. It's 11 chapters, The Trail, for publication in the Solzhenitsyn Reader. But I wanted to sort of document my father's commentary on the entire work, sessions that I tape recorded, with his approval, of course, and that have been tremendously helpful to me as little by little I embark, little by little is the operative word, upon the task of translating the entire work, as I hope to do. So now here is my new translation of Inception, the prologue to the Trail, which describes the dawning of his heroic project. Heroic already because, remember, every single line had to be conceived and committed to memory. It's one thing to memorize something, something else to, I think those of you who are poets and writers, to conceive only here is an extra layer of impossibility. Sometimes to write down, then it's easy to memorize. He had to do both. Now, as we know from Vladimir Nabokov, translating poetry is a thankless and really impossible, fundamentally impossible task. If one translates the literal meaning precisely, all sense of poetry, at least as we understand it in Russia and in Russian, is lost. If one focuses on rhyme, the meter and the meaning are both forced into ever tighter and more unnatural straits. I have persisted in hewing religiously to Solzhenitsyn's meter, in this case a complex iambic multimeter, which seems to me absolutely crucial to conveying at least a pale sense of the original. Of course, I've made every effort to translate the meaning accurately and worked in as many rhymes as I could without forcing the issue. Now, let us set the scene. Prisoner Solzhenitsyn is awoken by the odious bell that signals the beginning of an endless day full of the indignities of camp life. Freezing cold, awful food, pointless counting of inmates, pointless searches, back-breaking labor, no time to think or to reflect. And finally, just before curfew, it is the faint sound of Beethoven coming from some distant speaker that provides the inspiration that he can and must describe all this, and do so by conceiving every line in his memory, in his mind. Remember that, like virtually everything Solzhenitsyn writes, this is not based on a true story. This is the true story. The opening of the trail inception. The blackened, wanted outlines of the watchtowers. From tower to tower, daylight starts to bleed upon the realm. From zone to zone, far in advance of daybreak, the rusty rails ring their reveille, their mirthful bell. Before the inmate count, we sup our fishy broth with pottage, then stand and mill around in our tattered, patched-up threads. The camps march forth to work, and our 4 times branded column sets off as well to meet the long day's dread. It will be so a year, and 5, and so again for 10. Forever same, again, again, again. They frisk, they count, they frisk again, they count again. Our wrists behind our backs, in 5s, submissive, bent. In peacoats black, we step amidst the pale sheepskins, amidst guards, statues, bronze with fire and flames, refracted light. And with our backs contorted, eyes downcast, we grimly trudge as if enacting burial rites. Though, truth be told, day after day, someone is buried. A toe tag on the corpse, for surety pierced by a bayonet's pike. Dawn and day. With cruel slowness rolls the sun along the stony sky. The pickaxe sparks against the frozen earth with helpless smite. There was and will not be a sparkling, happy life. A soiled rag in frost around the face wound tight. We bicker about rations. Foremen snipe the livelong day without an end in sight. The sunset cools the steppe. Moon's crimson disk begins to rise. In dark, we push, we glide, we rush headlong into our pen. In groups of stern-demeanored gangs, we charge to ease our hunger pangs, where goners, licking bowls, are ostracized by our contempt and camp's unwritten tenet. You guzzle down your soup, lose track of time and place, while right across, in steam bent over earthenware, is a forlorn, emaciated thinker's face, or one of ruggedness brought low by sickly wear. But he who reckoned up the time here reckoned well and good. We barely can exchange a sigh, much less a word. Again there rings above the camp a bell. Each to his barracks you and I set out. Line up, march under guard to cell, lights out. Do not believe it. It's not done. I know, I wait, yet I am helpless to prise open eyelids weighed with sleep. Just barely we doze off the bell, and in the dazzling moonlight's majesty, we come outside in comic capes, our blankets formless heap. We come out boiling, come out cursing one and all. The very stars above do pity, warmth, and dark embargo. When, of a sudden, from a speaker weeping, there faintly wafts toward us a dour Beethoven Largo. I give a start as soon as its tones reach me. I turn my grizzled, coarsened face to meet that sound. Oh, who, oh, when will learn about all this and staunchly write it down? With lucid understanding, not with ire. The time to write is now, precisely now. Sufficient to each hour is its own evil, heedless of days past. One's thoughts, like heavy millstones, barely turn and grind. At times, the soul lights up with feeble flicker. We must complete, even in chains that bind, the circle which the gods for us defined. I too will start my path. I'll lead the way by lines, mellifluous and measured verse. Perhaps I'll save from breach this dearly purchased, newfound gift of speech. Then will you grope my body, search and frisk in utter vain. Here am I, I'm all yours, no notes betray me. And toward God's miracle, our inextinguishable memory, you stretch your hangman's hands, but clutch to no avail. My labor, year on year, with me you'll ripen. Year after year, you'll walk my convict's road. The day will come, I know you'll warm not me alone, nor my blood only will you cause to run ice cold. As we have just seen, one of the striking things about music in Solzhenitsyn's works, their implicit or explicit soundtrack, if you will, is that the dramatic, cinematic way that music materializes in them is usually true to life. And by extension, this apparition of the great Largo of Beethoven's Seventh Sonata under the ruthless, frozen starscape of a labor camp is a classic case of life imitating art. Let us listen to the poignancy and tragedy that make up the essence of this remarkable movement. The trail takes us on a retrospective journey through Solzhenitsyn's childhood and adolescence to his student years, first marriage, breakout of war. A crucial theme, probably the crucial theme, that runs throughout is the shadow society within society. The archipelago of slaves coexisting in a parallel reality with free citizens of the Soviet paradise. The young author encounters them at every step of his way. The man who leapt to his death from the 5th floor of the secret police headquarters in Rostov, rather than face further interrogation and torture. The sidewalk was immediately sealed off and the bloody mess cleaned up. The Christmas Eve return of his grandfather, who had been in hiding for years, followed by the secret police, taken away and tortured, released, but arrested again, this time never to return 2 years later. His brilliant friend, Sasha Gemelli, the smartest and most handsome boy in their entire school, suddenly arrested, condemned for being a secret member of a Leninist organization, foolishly believing as they did, which was just a bunch of boys talking, but believing that Stalin was somehow corrupting Lenin's legacy rather than bringing it to a most perfect fruition. Or a hellish vision of an ant-like colony of people crowding a mountain, mining it by hand, seen from the author's boat trip down the Don River. Or a barge of prisoners then slowly flowing up the river facing them. Then another fearful encounter with a train of doomed prisoners and their harrowing faces that left an impression forever. So the young Solzhenitsyn already knew very well that something just under the surface, at least, was deeply rotten in the Kingdom of Denmark. Paradoxically, or perhaps quite logically then, the first serenity, the first real lyricism in the poem comes in chapter 5, when the author finds himself on the front, fighting against the Germans in Belarusia, as the Red Army inexorably pushes westward. Here is the beautiful beginning of that chapter. This is my translation published in the Solzhenitsyn Reader. Solzhenitsyn here, during a lull in the fighting, describes the vulnerable, unpretentious simplicity of the local landscape and how he falls in love with this land that he will never see again, and indeed never did. So a little bit of chapter 5, Besid. Besid is just a river, a smallish river that runs through that part of Belarusia, or Belarus as it's called today. Was not born there, nor had called it home, and will never visit there again. Yet my heart adopted as its own this infertile and forsaken land. Swamps and woods, no way for wheat to grow, fields nowhere, hard to raise tomatoes, sands and silt and wetlands cold and low, only rye and taters. On the hillocks, gray, unmoving, still and silent windmills. In the pastures, yellow flowers shorn of all sweet scent. Churches all beheaded, sorry shacks, foundations dismal, brushwood crossings, bridges rotten, wasted, bent. Tursk, Chechersk, and Zlobin, and Svetoye, Rogachev, Madory. There's a piece of me I know I left there, something that will come again to me no more. Ever for a long march on the ready, service I compelled, and service did I give. So light-headed, thoughtless, free, in future I would never live. We retreat, I'm sullen. We attack, I'm happy. From my flask I draw and fight with soul. Вишенки, Шапарня, Рудня Шляги, Бесид, Заболотье, Svержin, Ola. Fear and laughter and a soldier's simple death. Dnieper and Soj, Berezina and Drut. There's a something there I know I left. Now it's moot. Flowing toward the rapid, murky Soj, 'tween the aspen saplings on its banks, during autumn time both cold and fine, slowly running Besit cools without a ripple, as a placid lake without a current. Yellow crimson trees that line its shores lean their branches half the way across. During quiet weather, lightly as a feather, one can hear the leaves swoon down and drop. As the action heats up again on the front, so does the pace and meter of the poem. The famous chapter 9, Prussian Knights, Prussia, of course, being the easternmost realm of Germany, depicts, almost capturing it in graphic sound, the frenzied orgy of the Soviet march through East Prussia toward Berlin. And on this image, you see Soviet tanks rolling into yet another Prussian village. This section of the poem, too, is accompanied by a kind of soundtrack. Think of the Barber Adagio accompanying the war scenes in the film Platoon. And the theme song here of these war scenes is the strangely gripping romance Black Fan. Fan, as if one fans oneself with a fan, or one used to in the old days. So Black Fan, it's a transcription from Sarasate that was widely popular in the 30s and seems to be permanently lodged in Solzhenitsyn's brain, an earworm he would gladly be rid of if he could, even as the mayhem around him unfolds. The text of this song deals with the image of a beloved's face likened to a precious, mysterious black fan that is seductive and even irresistible, but whose essence is treachery. So before we hear some of the poem where this song plays a central role, let's hear the song itself. Here is the famous recording by the legendary Maria Maksakova, diva of the Kirov Opera, which is almost certainly the one that Solzhenitsyn and everyone else was familiar with. Black Fan.
Этот веер черный, веер драгоценный, он в себе скрывает верность измены. Сколько нежной ласки в мимолетных взорах обещает веер в кружевных узорах, серебристых зубах белые кораллы. Улыбаться так умеет ведь только дьявол. Но какое сердце устоять сумеет против этих взоров нежно устремленных. Этот веер черный, веер драгоценный, о, как он опасен для сердец влюбленных, для сердец влюбленных.
Those of you who know Russian will have just heard and noted the words «Но какое сердце устоять сумеет?» And oh, what heart could well oppose? That's Robert Conquest's translation. What heart could well oppose? This quotation from the song is used by Solzhenitsyn in this next excerpt of his poem, not in the expected context of attempting to withstand the charms of love, but attempting to withstand the lust for loot and revenge. Here is how the song fits into those remarkable Prussian nights that evoke the vengeful madness and destruction encouraged and fanned by the Soviet war machine all the way up to Stalin himself. I will read you 3 brief excerpts. The first sets the scene, announcing that Russian boys have reached the Prussian border and will wreak mayhem. The second focuses on 2 examples of the mindless looting already referred to, the setting on fire of an ancient Gothic Kirche, church, and the physical destruction of a piano that is too large, doesn't fit through the door, so too large to be hauled away as a soldier's trophy. And in the third excerpt, the tanks roll on, bent on further bedlam, always accompanied, it seems, by this theme song or soundtrack of Sarasate's Black Fan. I will read in Russian so you can experience that graphic, warlike rhythm to which I referred earlier, but please follow along, if you wish, with Robert Conquest's translation on the screen. Just 3 brief excerpts from Chapter 9, Prussian Knights. «Расступись, земля чужая, растворяй свои ворота. Это наша удалая едет русская пехота. Холмик, пать, мосток и холмик, стой, сходи, по карте тут. Будет злая ведьма помнить в небе зимнем наш салют». Столько лет все ближе, ближе подбирались, шли, ползли. «Батарея, слушай, трижды в небо прусское пали». 60-х в ветрожоге смуглых, зловеселых лиц. По машинам, по дороге, на Европу навались. Кто-то руки в растопырку, загонявшись, ловит кур и над всем возносит кирка свой готический ажур. Дну же жарко, дну же ярко, как при солнце, словно днем, как бы кирку нам под арку, вон под верхнее оконце, подцепить бы язычком. Пир и власть, ликует хаос, ничего душе не жаль. Кто-то выбил дверь в гастхаус, и оттуда прет рояль. В дверь не лезет и с восторгом бьет лопатой по струнам. Ах ты, утварь, значит, нам не достанешься бойцам. Не оставлю военторгу интендантам и штабам. Снова катим по пылающей стране, и мотив из Сарасате так и вьется в уши мне. Неотстанный, непоборный, зов лукавый, не военный. Этот веер черный, веер драгоценный. Величаво и зловеще труд пылает вековой. Пламя плещет, пламя хлещет у меня над головой. То багрово, жирно, жадно языком махнет в окно, то над башенкой оно располощется нарядно, златоструйно, многоскладно, огневое полотно. И опять он, из-за черно-красных пятен, зол, торжественен, понятен, соблазнительный гриф, тот же дьявольский мотив, тем же крадущимся скерцо, все сильнее, все сильнее. Ну, какое сердце устоять сумеет? It was right here at the Prussian front that Solzhenitsyn, as mentioned, was suddenly arrested, the military censorship having read, as mentioned, his naive letters to university friend on the Romanian front, proposing a resolution number 1 to tackle problems of Soviet society. Well, resolution number 1, 2 people, that's already a counter-revolutionary organization. And so according to Soviet law, he was legitimately thrown into a prisoner's train, heading back east. Secret trial, 8 years, sentenced quite legitimately to 8 years in the labor camps, and perpetual exile. That's a lovely touch of Soviet jurisprudence. Perpetual, just as long as you're alive, you are exiled somewhere on the edge of the world. So as he tries to make sense of his own past and Russia's, his fatherland that he sees flitting by through the small window of the train, he asks himself, how could he not know, not really know that the USSR was overflowing with labor camps? So in this especially memorable passage we're about to hear, which comes toward the very end of this chapter and indeed of the entire poem, The Trail. This is the end of chapter 11. We hear Solzhenitsyn himself, a half century later, in old age, reciting it in a sing-song way, recalling the melancholy rhythm and inflection of these rolling train wheels. As the train rolls along, he sees clearings, forests, villages, all the classic features of the Russian landscape, all the traditional features. But he wonders that its chief and most enduring feature has now become the clumsy, four-legged scarecrows of the camp watchtowers. More common, he observes, than graveyards, and perhaps more numerous even than white birches themselves. Again, the meter and manner of his reading here evokes this rolling prisoner train. Let's listen. This is 50 years after it was conceived.
Стучат и грохочут вагоны, по порожню веселы, за клочьями дыма в нагоны бегут вперемешку стволы. Все пусто, ни человека. Стоим на платформе, мороз, проносится лесосека, кустовник на ней порос. То избный порядок мелькучий вдоль прясельной городьбы, то проволокой колючей обтянутые столбы. И в меркоте перед вечерней проносятся, я узнаю, нам русским приветом матерним и пугалом воронью. А четверо ног по кобылье, опершись, облезла сера, поставленная на копылья охранная конура. Примета родного пейзажа, при лагерной вышке тес, ты чаще погостов и даже не чаще ли белых берез. Идут пятилетки и войны, лишь ты не подвластна годам. Все так же назойно мелькаешь вослед поездам. Повсюду назойно промелькиваешь поездам. Изгнившая вышка призрак с провалами черных дыр, да призраком коммунизма по Марксу вошла ты в мир. Видением коммунизма по Марксу вошла ты в мир.
Then came the long years of labor camps. You see Solzhenitsyn pictured here in his camp uniform. Remember the 4 times branded column from inception? These were the 4 numbers that prisoners were required to wear on the forehead, chest, leg, and back. In addition to his ceaseless work on the trail, which involved spending as many as 10 days of each month just repeating the lines so that none of them would be lost to memory, Solzhenitsyn composed a few separate short poems. I would like to read you just one of them, Prisoner's Right, in which he reflects on his own unjust imprisonment and that of millions of others, yet ultimately rejects his well-earned right to vengeance in favor of what he comes to see as his only true right, to be a rancorless son of Russia. This is from my own translation, published in the New Yorker in 2006. Prisoner's right. Yoke of years that we lived in a prison grants no right. We're entitled to naught. Not to pulpits, nor lecterns, nor glory, nor power, nor halos of saints, nor in memoirs to mix with fatigue our colorless ashen complaints, nor that armies of youths should now run astride life by the path that we treaded for them. All will go as 'twill go. There's no point to pound out the wheel's rut in advance. An illumined interior suffering core. May for everything this be our one recompense. It's the loftiest gem of all earthly gemstones. And to carry it home undefiled, let of our phantom rights then the very least be our secreted right to an equal revenge. There's a number so endlessly long, comprehensible just to Chinese and to Russians, all those fallen extinguished without guilt or trace. In that number we're nil upon nil upon nil. Our right is but one, to be rancorless sons of our luckless and sad Russian land. Let our grievances burn, rot, decay deep inside. To the outside will spring living shoots. Only then, looking up, will our Russia's fatigued countryside see the sun it awaited so long. As the years went by, the connections between Solzhenitsyn's writing and music became more broad, as other artists sought to find or extrapolate their own readings or better hearings. Amongst my father's most beloved works are his miniatures, often referred to as prose poems, in which he frequently magnifies some trifling detail of everyday life into a metaphor for something greater. It is these miniatures from the late 1950s that have been used recently to great effect by the brilliant oboist Alexei Utkin in a program in which he pairs a reading of each miniature, not all of them, but he selects, I think, 14, of each miniature with a prelude of Shostakovich from the Opus 34 set. Curiously, Utkin's concept is that the music be heard first, only then followed by the miniature that goes with it. And so I will do now, play for you the E-flat major prelude, followed by Reflection in Water, to remain true to Utkin's ear for the resonances here. I will read again in Russian while the English translation projects on the screen. Let's make it official. отражение в воде. В поверхности быстрого потока не различить отражение ни близких, ни далеких. Даже если не мутен он, даже если свободен от пены, в постоянной струйчатой ряби, в неугомонной смене воды отражения неверны, неотчетливы, непонятны. Лишь когда поток через реки и реки доходит до спокойного широкого устья, или в заводе остановившейся, или в озерке, где вода не продрогнет, лишь там мы видим в зеркальной глади и каждый листик прибрежного дерева, и каждое перышко тонкого облака, и налитую голубую глубь неба. Так и ты, так и я. Если до сих пор все никак не увидим, все никак не отразим бессмертную, чеканную истину, не потому ли, что еще движемся куда-то, еще живем? Another recent musical response to Solzhenitsyn's oeuvre has come from the respected composer Aleksandr Tchaikovsky, no relation, who requested and received permission from my father to set One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich as an opera. One Day, of course, was the novella that caused an overnight international sensation upon its publication in November 1962 in the premier literary journal Novy Mir. It depicts an ordinary life an ordinary day in the life of an ordinary Zek prisoner, serving, like countless other innocents, an ordinary 10-year sentence. In other years, it was 25 years, was the fashion to give 25 years, but in those days, 10-year sentences only. As he navigates the prisoner, Shukhov, the perils of that day, and manages to survive. The famous ending is worth revisiting. Quote, Shukhov felt pleased with life as he went to sleep. A lot of good things had happened that day. He hadn't been thrown in the hole. The gang hadn't been dragged off to Sotsgradok. He'd swiped the extra gruel at dinner time. The foreman had got a good rate for the job. He'd enjoyed working on the wall. He hadn't been caught with a blade at search point. He'd earned a bit from Cesar that evening. He'd bought his tobacco. And he hadn't taken sick, had got over it. The end of an unclouded day, almost a happy one. Just one of the 3,563 days of his sentence from bell to bell. The extra 3 were for leap years. But back to the opera. I'm well familiar with it, having conducted a concert version and being at this very moment in the midst of preparations for a new production for the chamber stage of the Bolshoi Theater, which will debut next month, just very soon, a couple of weeks. In the clip that I want to show you from the original production 10 years ago, when the opera was written, 12 years ago maybe, the disciplinary officer, Volkovoy, comes to fetch the captain, who is a former army captain, now just one of the Zeks, and he comes to drag him off to 10 days in the IC cell block for an infraction committed early that day. So as the captain, as their mate is led away, the others attempt to cheer him up. Keep smiling, don't let them get you down. But they know, just as he knows, that 10 days in that block meant tuberculosis and ruined health for life. 15 days, and you'd be 6 feet under.
Prav Куда? Сам знаешь, сколько суток. 10. Не забыл волковой. Прощайте, братцы, прощайте, братцы.
Solzhenitsyn had no further ambition to write poetry as such, once he found himself able, even at great risk, to actually write on paper and carefully hide away what he had written every night. But the miniatures of the late 50s are often considered masterpieces of poetry, though prose poetry, of course. An account of the rhythm and purity of their language, their highly evocative imagery, and their distillation of a single mood. My father had always wanted to return to this small form in the decades following, but found himself unable to do so when torn away from his fatherland throughout the long years of exile in Switzerland and Vermont. Besides, he was now working full-time on the Red Wheel, his magnum opus of the Russian Revolution. So it was only after the completion of the Red Wheel and after his return to Russia in 1994 that Solzhenitsyn again felt ready to return to this ultimate of short form and produced a second luminous set of miniatures that forms a gratifying complement to the original set from 40 years earlier. So in these late ones, one might say that the rhythmic pulse is slower, the artistic conceit more modest, the personal confession more direct. At least it seems so to me. Here is one of them, a great favorite of mine, entitled Growing Old. For all that has been written, this translation is Alexis Klimov and Michael Nicholson, a beautiful translation by two renowned translators. For all that has been written about death's horrors, what an organic link death is in the chain of life when it comes without violence. I remember a Greek poet I knew in the labor camps. He was still in his 30s, but not long for this world. Yet his gentle, wistful smile betrayed no fear of death. This amazed me. But he told me, before the onset of death, we go through an inner process of preparation. We grow and mature to meet it, and then it no longer holds any terror for us. Barely a year was to pass before, at 34 years of age, I experienced the same thing firsthand. Month by month, week by week, as I drew ever nearer to death and adapted to it, my readiness and resignation outstripped that of my own body. How much easier it is then, how much more receptive we are to death when advancing years guide us softly to our end. Aging thus is in no sense a punishment from on high, but brings its own blessings and a warmth of colors all its own. There is warmth in watching little children play, little children at play, seeing them gain in strength and character. There is even warmth to be drawn from the waning of your own strength compared with the past. Just to think how sturdy I once used to be. You can no longer get through a whole day's work at a stretch, but how good it is to slip into the brief oblivion of sleep. And what a gift to wake once more to the clarity of your second or third morning of the day. And your spirit can find delight in limiting your intake of food and abandoning the pursuit of novel flavors. You are still of this life, yet you are rising above the material plane. The shrill cry of the chickadees in a snow-clad wood in early spring holds twice the charm, for soon you will hear it no more. So listen to your heart's content. And what an inalienable treasure your memories prove. This is something the young are denied, but you carry them all with you unfailingly. And a living portion of them calls upon you each day during the infinitely slow transition from night to day and again from day to night. Growing old serenely is not a downhill path, but an ascent. But Lord, spare us from an old age racked by poverty and cold, the fate to which we have consigned so very, very many. Tonight we have heard some of the music that acts as protagonist in Solzhenitsyn's works. We've heard the musical inflections of his poetry and his prose poems, heard also some of the music inspired by or connected to his work. What about his own love of music? What music moved him the most? from many conversations over the years, I can tell you that for him, as for me, and for many of you, and for millions of others, the ultimate solace, support, and succor was to be found, in the end, in Beethoven. And so I'd like to read to you from 3 diary entries, never previously published in English or translated. So again, this is a new translation from myself, that give us a glimpse into his view of the master. 9th of June, 1969. It's a very short clips here. For among creative paths, there are many of disorder, confusion, deviation, but only one harmony, the one derived from God. This harmony is captured and relayed by Tolstoy, while Dostoevsky seemingly fails to see it, though he casts about in epiphanies and prophecies. Albeit, Tolstoy too falls somewhat short of this ideal. Now, Pushkin. All of Pushkin is built on this harmony. Then again, he is a poet. Strange to say, but in literature, I feel closest to Beethoven, as to a forerunner and older brother. My highest aspiration would be to create literary counterparts to his symphonies and concerti, novels that would resemble them in tone, in harmony, in feeling. 5th of January, 1970. An important trait of Beethoven was pointed out to me. His changes of tempi are free, natural, diverse. It seems to me that this is in me as well. So here's yet another reason why I feel such kinship with him. And 30th December, same year. Recently, Le Monde, and now also a reader in private correspondence, compare me with Beethoven. This comparison flatters me more than any other could. To be honest, I think it to be the most apt one, if not, of course, by scale, then at least by kinship. I come from the same place and the same psyche. Indeed, it is easy to see parallels, not only in Solzhenitsyn's recognition of the decisive role of form and architecture in shaping his literary cathedrals, but in a shared refusal to compromise in matters of integrity. Most of all, Solzhenitsyn, like Beethoven, is an enduring champion of human dignity and living testimony that it is indeed our consciousness, our inner spirit, that determines our being, and not vice versa. And so, in conclusion, let us bring this exploration of poetry and music in Solzhenitsyn full circle to where we began this evening, the inimitably bewitching world of young Beethoven. I will play for you another Largo from that magnificent period, this one from the Grand Sonata, Opus 7, that matches the first Largo you heard in its purity and chasteness, but in great contrast to the despair of that D minor Largo, conveys a mood of quiet consolation and hope, utterly appropriate to the vector of Solzhenitsyn's own artistic and humanistic vision.
Gentlemen, we'll take 5 minutes and we shall come out, and you're welcome after our short conversation to ask any questions you may have after this wonderful presentation. See you in 5 minutes. After your presentation, it's really hard to start any kind of a conversation that would be meaningful. But I would like to hear a little bit, I think our audience as well. How was it growing up with Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn?
I'm afraid this may be disappointing to some, but it was very easy to grow up in our household, in his household, in our family. I've known some wonderfully great men and women in my life's journey so far. Obviously, my father among them, and I have to say that from what I've observed, his just lack of pretentiousness and lack of any special catering to his needs and artistic moods was really is what made it so easy. He was uncompromising in his work, and he took his work very, very, very seriously, as I'm sure you know. But he did not, I think, take himself or his persona seriously, and did not consider himself to be in any way somehow above or things of that nature. So the only requirement, limitation, constriction for us growing up was to respect his work, and specifically by observing, by not being too loud until 3:30 p.m. Which usually was when we would come back from school. But if it was a non-school day, then we would not play basketball or run around like mad, as boys will frequently do, until to give him a chance to really use those morning hours. So other than that, he was it was wonderful. He was a wonderful father.
But what about practicing the piano?
He was very tolerant of the piano, and indeed there was never a restriction on music. So yes, I practiced whenever. No, I think he, it was more a question of getting me in the practice room, like so many children. So if I would practice, I think all was well.
And he was happy with your choice of your career and your brothers?
Very happy. Surprised. This love of music that, of course, was a big theme tonight, was purely from the sidelines for him. Never played an instrument, never felt he had any special ear or sensitivity to music, just loved music so much. And similarly on my mother's side. So they were surprised to have, they did not expect to have a musical child. And if anything, I've told this story, they had somewhat of a bias against children, their children, at any rate, studying music because of the great dramas that unfolded in many families they knew back home where the Russian way and then the Soviet way on top of that, you study piano, you practice 2 hours a day, you practice 4 hours a day, and we know that can have extraordinary results, but also in many, many cases, the ones we don't hear about, the ones that don't win the Van Cliburn or the Tchaikovsky competition or et cetera, ruined lives or certainly ruined childhoods. And so they never thought they would push children into that, but I think we're very happy that it happened.
We clearly are lucky to have you having been encouraged the way you were.
Oh.
But I will now move to your translating career. I mean, you have dedicated a lot of work to the translations we have heard tonight. And you used several times the word fatherland, which within our culture framework, it may sound strange. Would you speak a little bit to the concept of fatherland in the cultural context, and why in Russian and within Russian culture and within Russian history, what kind of a role did it play?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. I suppose there are many, many cultural connections and adumbrations and on the sidelines of this. Fatherland is a very deep word. Motherland is a very deep word. Homeland also. Somehow a little bit, nothing political, just a little bit. That word is somehow less special now that we have a huge government department that is named, Homeland Security, and it's somehow the word, maybe just one hears it so often in the news or sees it at the airport, Homeland. But all of these are wonderful words. Yes, and we think of Mother Russia often in English, but not as much in Russian. I would say Matushka Россия, Matushka Rus, it's there, but I think just as much there is Отчизна or Отечество. And I would say that before we even say that it's a Russian concept, it comes, as far as I know, it comes from Rome. Mm-hmm. And maybe before Rome, and somebody will educate me in that, but patria, right, is that Roman notion. And it's interesting you mentioned this too, because this chapter 11, you might have noticed I didn't give it a title because it does not exist yet in English. And the Russian title is Dym Отечества. Dym Отечества. And I've been thinking for a number of years how that should be translated. It's a very famous phrase in Russian tradition, in Russian poetry, in Russian culture. Dym Отечества. I think everybody knows, I'm sure some Russians here, everybody knows Dym Отечества, but I'm not sure anybody quite knows where it comes from. And as I researched that a little bit, and it's not Derzhavin, one of our founding kind of poets of the Russian language. It's not Pushkin. Derzhavin used it. It goes back further. It becomes a little unclear where it's from, but really it appears that it goes back to Ovid and Fumus Patriae. And so I'm tentatively entitling this chapter 11 Fumus Patriae because I think that, and so what does that mean, the smoke of the fatherland? And I've asked a couple of people over time, what would that mean if the smoke of the fatherland? And people don't know unless they're perhaps thinking of Ovid and thinking of Latin Roman connections. Smoke as in war, smoke as in fire. And he used it in a sense of the familiar smell, the comforting smell of home cooking, of being home. And so how to translate that without an extensive footnote? So my thought is that perhaps if smoke of the fatherland will sound funny, then maybe Fumus Patriae will make more sense, because people will immediately, if they don't know Latin, still will reach and think, well, this is something I need to look up or think what it might be. So a lot of interesting kind of intersections there. Patria. Отечество.
is your biculturalism really helpful, or is it sometimes really difficult to translate?
Well, I hope it's more helpful than anything else. But one has to be very careful, as in music, not to superimpose an easy, a facile solution that feels good because I like it. That's, for me, is not enough. When we play somebody else's music, translate someone else's poetry, or prose for that matter, we need to try to find that organic reality that was in the original conception. And so I think that's maybe the thing I try to guard against, is not to be too facile in saying, oh, well, this is how we'll set it up in a different way. And one wants it to be as intelligible as possible, of course. But one wants to, I think, the translator's voice to be sidelined, and the author's voice to come into focus. That's the goal.
You mentioned Ovid and his exile. Is that how Solzhenitsyn felt in exile, this constant longing?
Constant. Somehow, sometimes I've heard people say, well, what was wrong with America? No, not, it wasn't that. And Switzerland, same thing. And it was nothing that was wrong with here. It was with a yearning, that Sehnsucht for home. It does seem to be a little more deep-rooted in Russians, speaking broadly, than in many others, or in certain other nations who are perhaps more cosmopolitan or more at home in many places. Maybe it's to do with Russia's profoundly difficult history, but yes, that sense of yearning for home, as you said, Hannah, was surely every day for the entirety of those 20 years of exile. Also, 20 years may not seem that long in retrospect. And I think in retrospect it didn't once he went back. 20 years, I mean, right? I'm old enough to know 20 years is not that long. I've, now lived, more than twice 20 years. So I'm still here, it's manageable. But when one doesn't know, of course, when that exile will end, if ever. Remember, he said on the first day of his exile, interviewed by the BBC, among many others, on that 13th of February, 1974. And he says, and the journalist Yanis Sapiets, wonderful man, in his own right, it says, well, something asks him about the rest of your life now in the West. What about it, more or less? And he says, no, I will go back. And he says, and he believed that from the beginning. Of course, that belief was tested very, very severely by the apparent lack of progress in that direction in terms of historical winds that seemed for a very long time in the mid-70s and late 70s and early 80s and still in the mid-80s to be blowing the other way. So he was grateful to the West, particularly to America, which was the bulk of his exile years. It allowed him, it extended his life probably by decades. It allowed him to complete the Red Wheel. It allowed him to raise his family in safety and in peace and in comfort and all of those wonderful things. But the longing to go back was ever present, ubiquitous, and finally fulfilled.
And he found his return fulfilling, or was it yet another test?
A very great test, because he had hoped much of his non-belletristic writing in the 70s and 80s, and indeed early 90s, in other words, through those 20 years, focuses on the future of Russia, a post-communist Russia, and what that might be like. And specifically how to descend, and he had that striking expression, how to descend from the icy cliffs of totalitarianism to a normal, pleasant valley. I'm adding my own imagery now, but the icy cliffs is his. And so how to descend without perishing, without falling headlong. And this was his greatest concern. He believed communism would fall. But what next? So in a sense, he was, it's right, like they always say in business, it's not this challenge, the next challenge, the next, it's what's ahead. So he was thinking, what's ahead for Russia? And what happened was, for him, the worst possible scenario. Well, the worst being, of course, communism not falling, but communism having fallen, it happened in the most painful, in the most corrupt, in the most thoughtless way in terms of how the leaders of post-Soviet Russia managed or didn't bother managing the future and the present. So yes, the return was deeply fulfilling for him, just to be rooted, to be back at home, to feel that Russian soil under his feet. But it was a great, tested his belief, tested his hope. When will Russia ever reach that semi-normal state?
I think we should open the floor.
At any time, did your father ever express the thought that his life might have been much worse had he not been found out, had he not been arrested, had he not suffered that gulag hell?
The question, maybe I'll just repeat in case not everybody can hear. Did he ever express the sentiment that his life would have been very different had it not been for that first, also second arrest, but that first, I think you mean the first arrest in 1945? Oh, yes, very much so. He felt that it was maybe the greatest blessing that he was given, of many blessings in his life and many sufferings. Because being brought down to the very, very bottom of the sea, the very bottom of society, having nothing left to lose, finally he was surrounded by people who could speak freely, and who did. His fellow prisoners. And what a group it was in that summer, that spring of 1945, that bittersweet spring he describes in the Gulag archipelago, when his mates are finally, the good part of the war is finally there, and yeah, the looting and all this aside, but really the great victory, again, another war to end all wars, sort of, is coming, and the taking of Berlin, and the easy part, the good part, and the great part, and the victory, and allies, and all the good stuff. And they're locked in the rotting cell in these dungeons of the Butyrka prison. This is before the camps, just waiting to be processed and tortured and interrogated. He got off very, very lightly with it. He was not tortured, for example, as many, many others were. At least not in the dramatic way that we think of it. But yes, so the people he met in that prison in May of 45, and they could hear the salutes, the 21-gun salutes, the 100-gun salutes on May 9th, or maybe is it May 8th in Russia? There's the discrepancy. Anyway, yes, so, and these were doctors, engineers, fellow army officers, priests, theologians, scientists, professors, peasants, everybody, all strata of society who had, for one reason or another, fallen afoul, or for no reason, of course, usually fallen afoul of the state. And so he learned from them. He was still Marxist in his basic outlook because that's what he was, along with everybody else, was brainwashed into believing. Marxism basically is good, and we have basically this wonderfully progressive society, Stalin, yeah, as I mentioned, but overall, good stuff. And his arguments were, he lost every argument he ever began in prison from people who had already been through 15 years of camps, from people who had been to the West. He said, you don't know what you're talking about. The West it is the land of milk and honey. By the way, that was the 30s. In other words, just speaking of economic difficult times, but difficult not compared to what was happening in the Soviet Union. So yes, that he says, he blesses his prison because it allowed him to, could have killed him, but didn't, and allowed him to find his footing, find his moorings, and really learn about life. So great question, and he shut something else just to finish artistically. He says, where does he say this? I have to think. He said, I shudder to think of what kind of writer I would have become had it not been for that experience. And I think what he means by that is that he obviously is a writer of great talent. And so how a writer of such talent would place his talent at the service of a barbarous, anti-human regime, that is what frightened him deeply, as indeed we saw with Maxim Gorky and Alexei Tolstoy and so many others, really genius or great writers who said, I will gladly praise slave labor, as Gorky did, and apparently still be able to sleep at night. And he feared he could be that.
Yes? Please.
I have a question regarding where is your home culture? Because I would imagine it's having a father you had must be such a strong connection with Russia. On the other hand, when we hear you speak, you think that you are so much part of this world. So I was curious where your home is culture.
It's a great question. I've been asked that question my whole life. I still hesitate to answer it convincingly. The question was, where is my home? Where is my heritage? Who am I? Something like that, right? And having heard me read and speak tonight, I'm not quite sure. I will say that despite my facility in English and my comfort in the cultural environs of New York, of America, of the West, I think the deepest, almost subconscious stirrings inside me when it comes to these issues tend to emanate from that Russian heritage. Maybe in large part because Russia is so unhappy. Today, not so unhappy as under communism, but nonetheless, a long, long way to go from, may I say, as not completely, as an American, a little bit from the outside, from the very, very happy, broad state. I know it doesn't always feel like that here, but from that I think most foreigners would observe in the United States. So maybe for that reason, maybe if it were reversed, and America was the unhappy land, the miserable land, maybe it would be different. But I suppose I'll continue to consider that as my life rolls on.
Yes, please.
Oh, I want to ask if someone asked me where I would want to be when the wall fell, or when the Soviet Union ended, other than being in the actual place where those events occurred, it would be in a room with your father, just to see what the expression and reaction was of the person who, in many ways, was responsible for one of those events. And were you there, or can you tell us anything about that moment?
what a wonderful thing to say. The gentleman says he wishes what one could have been in the room with Solzhenitsyn on that day, 9th of November 1989. I was in London studying, and yes, what a day. And I wished I could be with him. I wished it then, and I guess I've reflected upon that very thing over time. I'll never know. Of course, this was before internet, before telephone. I mean, not. Wait, I'm dating myself. Before phone calls were expensive and sort of difficult, and wasn't. So I didn't call home very often from London. That was back when we wrote real letters, and thank God for that, because I have to me, a priceless trove of correspondence with my father and my mother from those years. So yes, I remember his letters of that time, and of course the unspeakable joy to see this longed for. I don't know how to describe this miracle, and so many did say annus mirabilis. 1989, for it to actually occur, incredible. I was with him on August 21st, 1991, when the Dzerzhinsky statue was toppled, if you remember those pictures. Or maybe somebody here was there in Moscow. He was not a huge addict of television, let's put it that way. Did not watch the news sometimes, but mostly found TV news to be fairly insipid and got news from radio or newspapers. But he was glued to the TV that day. And the light in his face and the joy and I think it's anybody who, I think so many people felt that, especially anybody who came from under that regime. And I mean all our brothers and sisters in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and someday in China and Cuba and everywhere, who will feel that someday, will feel that liberation. So despite, again, the many deviations and tortuous paths that followed, nothing can take away I think the purity. If anything in life can be pure and joyous and full of absolute idealism, and those must be two of the greatest days in human history, among many, many black, dark days as well.
Last question, please. Oi. Okay.
Faith. Question is about my father's faith, religious faith. It was far from a straight path. He was raised by his mother, as I mentioned, and showed you her picture. She did her best in extremely difficult circumstances, as many parents, I'm sure, did and tried. And one of the things she tried to do was to instill in him her just normal Orthodox Christian faith. She wasn't any, special, just a normal person with and he grew up in that flavor. In other words, they would go to church. There was only one church allowed to remain open out of 200 in Rostov, in the city where he grew up. They would go there despite very strong and concrete present danger, risks to her, and she was fired from one job after another. Somebody said she's been seen in church. This is militant atheism. My father wore a neck cross. Is that the right expression? across around his neck, and so summer T-shirts, one can maybe see it. And the other children in school would rip it off with the encouragement of the teachers. We say no bullying now. Even bullying is too much. Well, this was, I guess we call it hate crime now, right? But so absolutely, go get him. This is so they beat it out of him very quickly, because only at home, only his mother and his aunt, who would sometimes visit, there were the two people in the world, in his world, I suppose, people he saw at church, who had that, and then everything else around: school, teachers, peers, the whole milieu and atmosphere of the city and of the country was militantly, violently anti-religious. And not only anti-religious, but substituting this worldly creed, this certainly just as if it, in other words, the creed of Marxism. Leave aside all the pretensions of science and dialectical materialism and so forth. The creed. This is now, we don't believe that anymore. Now we believe this. And so yes, he by high school, certainly by university, was a typical, in that sense, a typical Soviet young man, for whom faith was something to be embarrassed of, something no longer relevant, and so forth. Well, life had other plans for him, and as he went through war, I think it got him thinking. Remember that, somebody will help me, no atheists in foxholes, right? So I think for many people that must be true. So the war, then his arrest. And the first question, of course, if you read the Gulag Archipelago, the first question, chapter 1, arrest. Why me? That's the first question everybody asks. Well, partly because everybody's innocent in this, right? But so it's not why me? Oh, they found out my murder, or I stole $1 billion. No, why me? What did I do? And so that, and once one gets past the obvious question, the obvious answer that, well, the political answer, or the answer that, because this is a barbarous, inhuman society. But then on a deeper level, okay, but what am I supposed to do with that? What is my spirit supposed to do with that? What do I do? Do I become embittered? Do I become vengeful? So I think he asked himself those questions. Then he met these people I referred to, men. They were all men. There were plenty of women in prison, but separate prisons. Extraordinary men who of profound talent and great artists, and many of them, not all of them, of course, many of them would unashamedly profess their faith, what their version of their, and so that made, well, what does that mean? So it's not just silly old ladies who believe in God. It could be somebody else. Then the camps, and really being brought to, as that photo showed a little bit, I think, brought really to the verge of death. And maybe most of all, and again, this cuts across societies and regimes, and cancer or some other grave disease. I didn't mention this tonight because already evening was maybe, we didn't have time to go into, and not relevant to our topic, but he was, developed a very severe, deadly cancer in the camps, was operated on too late in conditions that defy imagining, and eventually, very quickly, I should say, the cancer came back just as he was being released into exile, and was supposed to die. And the doctor he went to see, finally was allowed to see a kind of a real doctor, was a former Zek himself. And he said, and they immediately established that rapport, and that, without, didn't need to be said. And he said, look, tell me the truth. In the Soviet Union, those of you who know Soviet medicine, never tell the patient anything. Never tell any truth. Especially something cancer. No, you're gonna be fine. It's fine. Just go home and so and he said, look, tell me, am I gonna be fine? He said, no. If 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. So, in short, anybody I think who would go through that in any system, facing his maker or you make the choice who you're facing, but when that clock is ticking, I think that more than anything else, or all of those factors in combination, brought him full circle to accept as a reasoning, suffering, living, greatly talented adult human person for whom this faith now had developed, had come through, had been earned maybe at the cost of all these experiences. And then the rest of his life, I think he never wavered in it. And I think we see that. It's obviously left unsaid, but in that beautifully reflective growing old miniature, we see that how I dare not speak, of course, for anybody except myself, but I wonder if that fear of death or not is tied up directly with that question. I don't insist on that at all. I just say that I imagine for many of us it would be, and it's reason to ponder. So I'm afraid that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it wasn't so important, such a help in his life, I guess throughout his life. He says in the poem Akathystus, which is really the poem where he describes that return to God. He says, you were always with me. I didn't know it. You were always with me. And that's what a deeply humble and beautiful sentiment, and most of all, true sentiment for him. Thank you for such wonderful questions.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Anna.